In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at the process of importing a bitmap in the software and how to size and position it using the Trace Bitmap tool to create vectors around that bitmap. We're also going to look at some of the key ways to edit those vectors after they're imported. Now, the created quality of the vectors will depend on the quality of the image. So to get started, let's go ahead and close this file. Okay, with that being said, let's go ahead and create a new file. So let's go ahead and click Create New File. And we want our job to be set to a width of 12 inches, a height of 4 inches, and a thickness of 0.75 inches. We want our material surface to be our Z0 position, and our XY datum is set to the center of our material. And let's just click OK. So first of all, we want to import some bitmaps we want to use on this tutorial. So let's go up to our file operations and click on the import bitmap tool. And as I've already downloaded the tutorial files associated with this video, I have the bitmap I need here. So let's just double click on that. And as you can see, it's imported it into our software in the very center of our material. Now you notice if you come up to the layers tab, you have a new layer called bitmap layer. Now this is important because it's going to make sure that our bitmap is behind our vectors. So when we're drawing them, it won't cover up anything that we're working on. So let's just click off that for the moment and click on our bitmap in the center of our worksheet. Now you'll notice that when I clicked on it once, I had this dashed line around the bitmap indicating that I have selected it. Now if I click on it again, you'll notice we get these handles around the bitmap that allow us to manipulate the size of it, to change the scale of our bitmap, and to rotate it. So let's go ahead and look at some of those options now. So if we go ahead and hover our mouse pointer over the bottom left handle, I'm just going to hold down the left mouse click, and I'm just going to drag this out and scale this out. And as you can see, it scales the bitmap relative to the handle that I was using. I'm just going to undo that by hitting Control and Z on the keyboard. And if I go ahead and now hold Shift while holding that same handle and dragging it out, you'll notice that it actually scales it from the center of this bitmap. And let's just get that back to the center. And again, I'm just going to hit Control Z to undo any changes there. And finally, let's rotate our bitmap. And there we are. So these are the options that you have at your disposal when you click on the bitmap itself. And if you ever have moved your bitmap and you need to recenter it, you can simply hit F9 on the keyboard and that will pop that back to the center for you. Okay, so now I actually want to straighten out this bitmap. So I'm just going to go up to the top here, left click on the rotation handle. I'm just going to rotate this to allow the word cycles to be relatively straight. So I'm just going to try and get that as straight as possible. And I think that looks pretty great there. So I'm just going to leave that there for the moment. Perhaps adjust it a little bit more by clicking the bottom right hand one here. There we go. That looks about right. Now, what you're actually going to notice is that the bitmap we have here is actually quite distorted. And this is because it's disrupting the grid of pixels that the bitmap is sitting on. It looks at this bitmap looks quite rough, and depending on the quality of the bitmap we use, the amount of distortion will change as well. In this scenario, we use quite a poor quality bitmap, and so you may not see this distortion if you were using a higher quality bitmap. But for now, we can have a look at how we can fix this. So if we go ahead and right click on our bitmap, you'll notice there's an option here called Bake Rotated Bounds. Now, you'll notice that it says rotated bounds. So when we bake this, we're actually going to get a brand new bounding box that is going to be bigger than the bitmap itself. And I'll show you how we'll fix that in a moment. So at the moment, let's bake the rotated bounds. You'll notice we've now got a new bounding box that is larger than our bitmap around the bitmap in the center here. Now, this has cleaned up the bitmap a little bit, which looks a lot better, and the size of the new bounding box might not matter so much, but if we were looking to size this bitmap up based on the text, for example, we may want to size it up but not have to worry about subtracting off this negative space around the bitmap. So let's have a look at how we can use the feature over here called the crop bitmap tool to try and help us get around this issue. But before we do that, we're first going to come up to the Draw Rectangle tool under Create Vectors. I'm just going to click on that. And I'm going to create a vector around the bitmap so I can encompass all of our text. I'm just going to click around here and drag that out and try and get all of this text into this rectangle. Okay, that looks pretty good. And as you can see, we've got all of our text in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and close, hit apply and then close our form. And as you can see, if I click on our bitmap, you can see the difference between our new rectangle boundary here and our original bounding box that we had baked. So how can we use this in conjunction with the crop bitmap tool I mentioned earlier? If we go ahead and click on our rectangle and then hold down Shift on the keyboard, click on our bitmap, and we're just going to go ahead and click on the crop bitmap tool. And as you'll notice now, it has cropped the bitmap down to this boundary that we have set using the rectangle around it. Now you'll notice that there's still a little bit of negative space at the bottom of this bitmap. So I'm just going to address that now. And I'm going to click on the outside rectangle, click on it once more, hover over our handle because we want to adjust the rectangle shape vector here. And I'm just going to drag it up a little bit until I get to a point where I'm happy, and that's about right. So I'm just going to let go. And with that rectangle vector still selected, I'm just going to hold Shift on the keyboard, click on our bitmap again, come back over to the crop bitmap tool, and there we are. We have a much better looking bitmap there. So we don't need our rectangle anymore because we're using that to help crop our bitmap. So let's go ahead and click on it and delete. So let's look at resizing our bitmap now so we can work with it. So if we make sure our bitmap is selected, we're going to come over to the transform objects and we're going to choose set selected object size. In this scenario, I want my width to be 11 inches and I'm going to make sure the link XY is checked. We're going to hit apply. You'll notice that when I hit apply, it is linked the X and Y and adjusted the bitmap accordingly. So let's just close that form out. And you can see that the bitmap here is not quite central. So with it still selected as indicated by this dashed line around the outside, we can just hit F9 on the keyboard and now it is in the center of our worksheet. Okay, so now we're getting ready to be able to trace our bitmap. Now we could do this manually, or we could use a great tool in software called the Trace Bitmap tool. So if we come over to Create Vectors, and if we just hover our mouse pointer over this tool here, it says Trace Bitmap, Fit Vectors to Selected Bitmap, which is exactly what this is going to do. So let's just click on that, and we can see that we have a plethora of options available to us. So let's, for the moment, look at black and white, and we will come back to look at color shortly. So for the moment, what the software has done is actually reduced all of the colors within our bitmap to white or black. And the way it's done that is it has mapped the colors by seeing whether they are closest to white or to black and has mapped them on our bitmap accordingly. And you can actually adjust this with this slider here. And if you move this up and down, you'll notice some of the bitmap gets darker as I move this towards the maximum threshold. Now there's an important slider to take note of because you will see, I'll point out an example here, you see the letter B here in the word liberator, and at the moment you can see the bottom of the B is actually joining the top here, and you may not actually want that because you may want a much cleaner vector. So if we take the slider and we can slide it towards the left here, you'll see that eventually it starts to come away from the top, and that gives us a much cleaner finish and perhaps a better looking design on what we're looking for in the scenario. Okay, so with the black and white covered, we're going to come back up to the color option now, and you'll see that the software has reduced the bitmap colors down to 16 colors, and you can actually affect this yourself. You may have noticed a minute ago I moved this slider up. You can actually move it down one by one, so now you have 15 colors, and each time you will move it to the left, it will actually reduce your color palette. So in this scenario, we actually want to use 4. So let me just move this slider down to 4. Okay, so now that we have these 4 colors, we can actually turn on any one of these 4 colors that we want to choose to trace. And when we turn these on, it will actually turn these colors to red. And the reason is because we have our trace color down here set to red. And I'll show you some of the differences. So you notice that I use the black color here, and it's highlighted anything on the bitmap that is black. So if I turn that off and we have like a darker gray color here, the software does its best to highlight the parts of the bitmap that are this dark gray color here. And you'll notice that the more colors I select, the more changes you can see as highlighted by the trace color over here. And you can always change this. So for example, let's say your bitmap is predominantly red, so you need a different color to represent your trace color. You can always go ahead and choose something like blue, whatever you need to suit your particular bitmap. We can also use the bitmap fading down here as well to try and get a better look at what we're working with as well. So you notice if I can fade this up and down, but at the moment I'm just going to reset that to default, and I'm going to use the black vector to trace around for the moment. So with that selected, I'm just going to go ahead and hit preview. Okay, so now we can see we have this black vector outline around our black bitmap color represented by the red trace color here, around the cycles and around the liberated text, and looks pretty good to me. So let's have a look at some of the other options in our trace bitmap tool. So at the moment you can see my mouse is hovering over the corner fit option. Now this refers to corners in our bitmap tracing. Now if I show you an example, if I turn this all the way to max and then hit preview so we can see the changes take effect. If I zoom in onto the dot on the letter I here, you'll notice that it has gone from arcs to straight lines, and it's given us very sharp corners around that. Similarly, if you come up to the letter C over here, you'll notice that the arcs that made up the letter C have become straight lines. So if I turn this back down to the default corner fit and hit preview, you should now see that we've got smoother arcs here, which is what we're actually looking for in this scenario. But it just helps to point out some of the intricacies of using the corner fit tool in the trace bitmap tool. So if we just go ahead and zoom back out to our active drawing limits, and we'll take a look at the next tool, which is the noise filter. Now with the noise filter, I'm actually going to change the color of the bitmap I'm going to use this time. I'm actually going to use the gray, and I'll turn off the black. I'm just going to hit preview with our noise filter set at default, which is 1. Now you'll see that we have a lot of little vectors drawn on screen at the moment here, because it's done its best to try and map the vectors around the gray parts of our bitmap here. But you'll notice if I change the noise filter, if I go up to say about 5 or 6, and if I click preview again, it gets rid of a lot of that noise. You'll see if it gets rid of a lot of those vectors. So it may happen that you may have a vector where, for example, if I turn the black back on, hit preview, you may have some of these outliers up here, for example. You may have some of these parts of the bitmap that may end up getting traced. And the way to get rid of that is to actually adjust your noise filter until you find that sweet spot, and you can get rid of some of these anomalies that you don't need, or some of these outliers that you don't need on your bitmap. So with that said, I'm just going to go back to the default noise, and I'm going to turn off our gray color for our bitmap, keep our bitmap to trace around the black color again, hit preview, and that looks great. Now at the present, these are all grouped together, and in this scenario I don't actually want to group them together, so I'm just going to come back over to this option here, it's group vectors. I'm going to click on that, click preview, hit apply, and now when I close this form and have a look at these vectors, you'll notice that only certain vectors are selected. So you'll notice, for example, this part of the B is actually separate to this vector here, and to this vector here, and to these vectors on here as well. And at the moment it's a little bit confusing looking at our vector outline of our bitmap. So I'm just going to go ahead and come up to the layers tab and turn off our bitmap layer so we can have a clear look at what we're working with at the moment. There we are. Now you'll notice there's this kind of a stray vector over here that we don't need, so we can just click that and delete that. And when you turn off that layer, it helps you just to see what you're working with more clearly. Now, while the software's done a great job of actually tracing around this bitmap, there are some areas that I do want to address, and it's actually done a pretty good job in most areas, but there's some areas I'd like to have a look at. For example, like the E here, I'd like to smooth that out just a little bit more, and you've got this kind of pointed area just here as well. And if we look at the bottom of our C here, you'll notice that it's got a bit of a point there as well. So we can go ahead and address these by clicking on the affected vector, hitting N for November on the keyboard, and we can have a look at maybe adjusting some of these vectors here. So as you can see, I can manipulate these nodes, I can stretch them out if I wanted to. For example, I could bring this out here if I wanted to elongate it a little bit more, but I'm just going to press Ctrl-Z on the keyboard to bring that back in. I will though add a point here. I'm just going to right click and insert a point, and I'm just going to drag that down ever so slightly just to make that curve less pronounced. And I'm going to come over to here now. I'm going to click on this vector. You can see it's gone straight into node editing right away. And you could delete this point. So if we delete that point, you'll notice it actually creates a straight line there, but that's not quite what I want. So again, Ctrl-Z on the keyboard. And this time I'm actually going to smooth this point off. And then you can see I can now manipulate the point here to kind of get the arc or the smooth arc I need here. So I can just play around with that a little bit and play around with this one here to try and meet what I need here and not have such a sharp point there as well. Again, I can come up to the C and do something similar. So if I come up to this point here, we can just right click on that and we can just smooth that point out, and then we can just adjust this point here and try and smooth it out a little bit so it's not as sharp on the end there. Again, we can also delete that if that point is needed, but remember, then you may get some straight lines that end up joining up this vector. Okay, so for now, let's just press escape on our keyboard. We're going to come up to the top here and hit zoom active view to drawing limit so we can have a look at our whole traced bitmap vector. So I'm pretty happy with that, but I still want to address the cycles text here. Now the software's done a pretty good job of tracing around that vector, and it's not the software's fault that that hasn't turned out too great in terms of the aesthetic look to the text here, but that's due to the bitmap. But we can address this if we go over to our create vectors and we go to the draw text tool, and I'm just going to type in the word cycles. I'm just going to pick an appropriate font. I've got quite a lot to choose here from, but I think I will stick with Arial for the moment. And I'm just going to go ahead and hover my mouse pointer over our text. I'm just going to move it to a more appropriate location after sizing it down a little bit. So I'm just going to pick this up. I'm just going to move it up here. Try and line up the C with the C of the cycles that we had from our bitmap, and let's just size that down a little bit. Again, just trying to keep it in line with our current cycles text. Let's just size that up a little bit now. Now it's not going to be perfect, and that's okay, but that looks pretty good for the moment. Okay, so let's just close out our form now. Actually, I want the text to be a little bit bolder, so I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that's still selected, go back into our draw text, and this time we can choose the bold to apply to our cycles and just to make it look a bit more pronounced in the software. Okay, so with that said, I can now go ahead and delete our cycles original bitmap text. So if I click on the software and drag my mouse pointer over these two cycles text, and with that selected, if I hold shift and click on my new text, the text we just put in via the draw text tool, that'll leave just the old bitmap cycles text selected. I can just hit delete on the keyboard, and there we are. Now we have our cycles text nicely displayed on our screen and lined up with our liberated text as well. So with that cycles text now in place, I can use that now in future as a basis to now go in and convert that to curves or ungroup that text and use my node editing tools to try and fix those letters in a little bit tighter, perhaps closer to the original design with our bitmap. But at the moment, I think I'm happy with my tracing, so I should go off and save this file now. So if we go up to File and click save. I'm just going to save this as our image to vector logo, and it'll be a .crv file, and we'll just save that on our machine. Okay, so with our file saved, that is the end of our tutorial. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope this has been useful to you. And I did cover some topics such as node editing and drawing that you may find useful to look at in some of our other tutorials, which you will find linked below. But for now, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.